and it's a pretty good crowd, it looks like.
Oh, good.
Recording.
Gary, it is exactly 6 p.m. U.S. time. So we've got about 3 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
What are you, 7 p.m.?
Yes, we are. 7:30 in Newfoundland.
Gary, it sounds like we're getting a little feedback.
Yes.
A little echo.
Well, once we get started, we'll ask most people to mute themselves, and that should work out.
And 1 minute to start.
Oh, Dad, you're probably gonna go with them tomorrow, so.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, you said you're going one?
No, you were gonna go.
It was in my teeth. On my teeth.
Get some chicken on your teeth, can you?
What's that there?
Oh, it's Mr. Dallison. Howdy. Hi.
Okay, folks, by my reckoning, it is 6:03 p.m. West time, 7:03 Canadian time, or what is that? Atlantic time, I guess. And welcome to this Zoom production of the Border Historical Society. My name is Josh Smith. I'm a professor at the United States Merchant Marine Academy and director of the American Merchant Marine Museum. And I'm here to welcome our speaker tonight, Gary Campbell. A few notes. First, if you could please mute yourself so that there isn't any feedback during the presentation or any other noises bleeding into the presentation. We would appreciate that. If you like this presentation and you'd like to see more, Border Historical Society would be glad to receive your donations. It's certainly not mandatory, but membership in the Border Historical Society is a mere 10 Yankee dollars a year, and we'd love to have that. Finally, before I introduce our speaker tonight, we welcome comments in the chat function, and that's a great way to ask questions as well. And we will address all those questions at the end of the presentation. So just type in your questions and we will get to you. And frankly, that's half the fun. But most of the fun, of course, is listening to our speaker, Gary Campbell, who is a retired Canadian Forces logistics officer. I believe something like 40 years in the service. Is that correct, Gary?
That's right.
Wow. He has a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Western Ontario, an MA in war studies from the Royal Military College, and a PhD from the University of New Brunswick. Military history is one of his great interests and passions, and I gotta say, he's good at it. and he has an especial interest in logistics history. And this is a carryover from his military career. He's written several articles about military history and authored 2 books in the New Brunswick Military History Heritage Series. I have both of them. One is The Road to Canada, the Grand Communications Route from St. John to Quebec. And the other is The Aroostook War of 1839. I apologize for my Yankee pronunciations if I have erred in it. His wife, Carolyn, is a former Air Force nurse. They have 2 married daughters, one of whom is a colonel in the Canadian Forces, and 4 grandchildren. His recreational activities include collecting militaria and membership in the local historical groups and seniors clubs. He also volunteers with the Royal Canadian Legion. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Gary Campbell. The floor is yours, sir.
Why, thank you very much. My presentation is going to be a bit of a blend between ad hoc and prepared notes. As I was telling Pam, I was really up on this stuff 8 years ago, but it's kind of developed a few cobwebs since then, but we shall see how it works out. So a thought comes to mind. What if they started and nobody fought? Certainly a catchy phrase, and it does grab your attention. And it also makes a good lead in to tonight's presentation. I first heard about the Aroostook War almost 50 years ago when I accompanied my new bride, Carolyn Jamer, to meet her family in Perth Endor. The subject caught my curiosity, and I always meant to write about it. I discussed it briefly in the book, The Road to Canada, and I'll just start the share screen here. Yeah, so here's what I'm talking about. Just a romp through the history of the disputed territory from 1783 to 1843. So I mentioned the Road to Canada, and we'll talk about what the Road to Canada is a bit later. But I touched on the Aroostook War briefly in it, but I didn't do much. There's a couple of problems, one of which was space, and secondly, there's enough material there I wanted to hold out for a second book, which I did. So based on my experience in writing The Road to Canada, there were 3 areas I wanted to look at in terms of the Maine-New Brunswick border dispute, the Aroostook War, call it what you may. And these are the military aspects, the legal aspects, and the timber activities that took place within the disputed territory, that large parcel of land that includes most of Aroostook County, Maine, Madawaska County, New Brunswick, and parts of Quebec. So I'll touch on these 3 themes during the presentation. And due to the nature of it, I may not develop each one as much as I might want to. However, for those who wish to know more, may I recommend the Aroostook War of 1839. And it will tell you anything you ever wanted to know, and possibly more. And if you really want to get into the nuts and bolts, get a copy of my dissertation, Forts, Brits, and Logs. So the Aroostook War occurred in 1839, and it's been greatly underrated, at least in my opinion. And that's because no actual combat occurred, and therefore it's looked at as sort of a comic opera affair. This is evidenced by the nicknames, the Bloodless Aroostook War, the Lumberman's War, the Pork and Beans War. However, it was a turning point in the border controversy and almost caused the Third Anglo-American War. So here's the outline of my presentation. I'm going to start with going over the key features of the land so you understand exactly what the problem is and the various key events that happened during the 60 years it took to sort things out. So let's start with the land itself. Basically, we're talking about this area right in here. And there were 2 key features here. The first is the Grand Communications Route. And this is an overland route that stretched from the Bay of Fundy / Atlantic Ocean up to the St. Lawrence River. And the important thing about this is that if you're going to do troop reinforcements or anything else into Lower Canada and Upper Canada, as Quebec and Ontario were known then, you'd usually come by sea. But the problem is for 5, maybe 6 months of the year, you couldn't do that because of ice in the river. Therefore, the only way to move troops to reinforce this area was along the Grand Communications route. And it was also a postal route and a courier route and things like that. And it usually seems that crises happened in the wintertime. The first recorded movement along this route that I have for British troops is during the closing phases of the American Revolution. Again, the War of 1812 to 15 saw troop movements along this route. I'm going to touch on later on the rebellions of 1837 and 1838. And of course, there was the Trent Affair of 1861. Again, all of these in the wintertime. And again, critical that this route remain within British control. And the other thing is trees. Forests of lovely, tall, white pine trees. And these trees were highly prized for their use as masts on sailing ships, and also their use as timber. There's a lot of money to be made there. So there's some treaties that affected this area. And the first one is the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution. And they tried to define the boundary in this area. And they said, you know, it goes from the source of the St. Croix River to the highlands and along the highlands. And these highlands divided those rivers that empty into the St. Lawrence River from those that empty into the Atlantic Ocean. And the next treaty was the Treaty of Ghent of 1814 that ended the War of 1812 to 15. And there were 2 articles in that that pertain to this presentation. The 4th article, they formed a boundary commission to resolve the ownership questions with islands in the Bay of Passamaquoddy. And that's why Eastport on Moose Island is part of Maine today and not part of New Brunswick, because they decided it was on the American side of the channel. And the other article, the 5th article, they wanted to resolve this boundary question. So looking at a map of the area, to start off with, the River St. Croix was not in use at that name. There is no river by that name. There were 2 possibilities. One was the, get my pointer here, the Macadavie, and the other was the Chinook. And you can see if you chose the Macadavie as the river, there would be a lot more territory involved in the area under dispute than here if you had the St. Croix. So they did an archaeological dig on, I think it's called Gosset Island in the, what is now the St. Croix River, founded the French habitation there in 1602, I think it was, determined that was the St. Croix River, and then they followed that up to a place called Monument, where they decided that was going to be the source of the river. Yeah, I'll just go back one here. So, and then the next boundary commission was formed after the War of 1812 to 15, wanted to decide just where the boundary was. So one of the first things they did was start cutting the line due north. And they cut the line up about as far as to where the line cut the St. John River just west of Grand Falls. And from there, they didn't, well, they knew what to do. They just couldn't reach a consensus. The American position was the boundary went all the way up here to the heights of land overlooking Riviere du Loup and ran down. And if the American position prevailed, then the Grand Communications route would be cut and the British would not accept that as a solution. So the British counterproposal was, oh no, the height of land is along the southern part of the watershed of the Aroostook River. So you have this land in here that became known as the disputed territory. Now, while all these border negotiations were going on, the land was being occupied by Europeans. Down here we have the Flanders that came after the expulsion of the Acadians. You had some Acadians here who, once the Loyalists arrived after the end of the American Revolution, moved up to the Madawaska area and formed what was called the Madawaska Settlement. Following the War of 1812, there were 2 military settlements, one along here and one here. So you can see the British were occupying the ground by putting military disbanded soldiers along the route. And prior to the War of 1812, they'd also built 4 posts, Fort Howe and St. John, the Fredericton Garrison, the Presque Isle Military Post just south of Florenceville, Bristol, and Fort Carlton in Grand Falls. So here you have the route fairly well delineated. It's being militarized to some degree. And the whole idea was by having retired disbanded soldiers here and here, you had a sort of a forcing beam if there was ever a problem. On the other side of the line, which is what they call the North-South line, there was American occupation happening. Holton was settled in 1806. In 1817, 1818, a group of American lumbermen moved into the area just west of the Madawaska settlement, sort of in the Fort Kent area. And along the Aroostook Valley, there was a mixed group of both British and American citizens in there. And the people here were very heavily engaged in the timber industry. And this, of course, caused various problems because a lot of this timber was not being cut legally. So you had what they call trespass timber, and there was an ongoing competition between the lumbermen to cut the timber and get it down the river to St. John, and the various land agents of both New Brunswick and Maine and Massachusetts to prevent this from happening. Now, if I hadn't mentioned it before, Massachusetts had an equal interest in this area with Maine, because when Maine was established as a state in 1820, half of the wild and undeveloped lands in here belonged to Massachusetts. So some maps show this area here, ownership, sort of like a checkerboard with the alternating squares belonging to alternating states. So up until about 1820, you know, the border issue went on. You had the Boundary Commission, they couldn't agree. You had the claim and counterclaim. And this changed when Maine became a state, because Maine was quite keen to have all of its inheritance. And to Maine, all of its inheritance meant the complete disputed territory. So Maine had agents going into this area, both the land agents to check on the cutting of illegal timber, perhaps not quite legally selling permits to cut, and also trying to encourage the American residents of this area and some of the Acadian residents that actually they were living in the United States. And they saw this as a way to enhance their claim to the area. And 1827 was an interesting year because there were 2 crises, I'll call them. The first one happened in the Madawaska, or the Aroostook Valley. It was called the Aroostook Riot, when a magistrate from New Brunswick went to enforce a writ against a person who had Arnold's cow, and a group of Americans living there stopped the police officer in his duties and seized the cow and sent him on his way. And more seriously, up in the Madawaska settlement, John Baker, who was a great proponent of this area being part of the state of Maine, on July the 4th raised a flag which had American symbols on it, declared they were not under British jurisdiction, and declared a republic. So the response by the British authorities was to clamp them all in jail, again causing an international incident. That died down. And I should mention, during this time, the British government thought they had an arrangement with the United States government that in the absence of any federal American presence in the area, they would exercise jurisdiction. That means they would have magistrates, peace officers, land agents to try to monitor the illegal cutting of timber, things like that. But what happened on several occasions that when this came to the test, it turned out it was more a gentleman's agreement, and the United States government, in face of opposition by Maine, sort of, what's the right word? did not honor the tacit agreement they had with the British reference jurisdiction. Anyhow, so we had the two crises of 1827. One of the more important things that came out of that was that Hancock Barracks was established in 1828. And the reason for doing that was twofold. One of the reasons was by having an American regular army presence there, it demonstrated American support for the state of Maine. And there was also the thought by having regular US troops in the area, it might tend to calm the situation down. And this didn't necessarily follow along. There's Hancock Barracks. Lovely picture of it. So time went on, and they still did not have a resolution to where the border was. And one of the provisions of the Treaty of Paris was that you could take it to an arbitrator. So they did. They went to King William of the Netherlands. And much, I think, to everybody's surprise, instead of opting for the American proposal or the British proposal, he came up with a compromise proposal, which ran the course of the border along the St. John River. Now, the British were satisfied with this proposal because it meant they kept control of the Grand Communications route. And Andrew Jackson, the American president at the time, was not opposed to it. However, Maine and Massachusetts were violently opposed to it because that meant if that was accepted, they would lose all of this land up here, and they were not prepared to do that. So they put the pressure on the federal US government, claimed states' rights, and the arbitration was rejected. So no sooner had this happened than Maine again started pushing the envelope. And Maine decided to incorporate Madawaska as a town in the state of Maine, and they proceeded to have both state and local elections. And again, this is in contravention of the tacit agreement between the US and Great Britain about exercise of jurisdiction. So the British came in and promptly put the ringleaders in jail. But again, a crisis with Maine and Massachusetts complaining about the way they were being treated. And a few more years went by, and what I call a perfect storm arrived. So this doesn't happen today, but the United States government decided to return excess tax revenue to the states. But it was going to be done on a per capita basis. That means each state had to do a census of its population to see how much money it would get. So they Maine sent a chapman named McGreely up to the Madawaska settlement to do a census. Now, there's an understanding between the British and American governments that, you know, if the American government wanted to have somebody in the area, they had to clear it first with the British. It wouldn't be a problem, but it was a courtesy to clear it. Maine was not participating in that agreement. So this sent really up there to do a census, and the British authorities arrested him, put him in jail. And Americans complained, they let him out. He went back, started the census again. They arrested him, put him in jail. He got out, third time back up doing his census, and they finally left him in jail. But again, this was pushing the harmony along the border. The other thing was the rebellions of 1837 and 1838. And these broke out in Lower Canada and Upper Canada. And the British needed to reinforce the troops there. And of course, both years, they flared up in the fall when the St. Lawrence River was closed to shipping. So reinforcements came up the Grand Communications route. The British informed the American government of this. The American government did not object, but Maine declared that its sovereignty had been impinged upon and made quite an issue of it. And why are we? Now, at the same time, there was also political rivalry in Maine. Both the political parties in Maine had been trying to outdo each other, promoting Maine's claim to disputed territory. And the Democrats, led by Governor John Fairfield, were elected to power in 18, replacing the Whigs led by
Gary, we're losing your audio. I think you have to speak more directly into the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just leaning over to read my notes here. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Anyhow, so the new government wanted to prove that it would advance Maine's claim better than the Whigs had. Now, another thing that happened is the Americans and the British were talking about forming a new boundary commission. And as part of the discussions, if they could not agree on the upper or lower level area of the border where it was, there was talk of coming up with a compromise resolution, which probably would have very much resembled the arbitration by King William of the Netherlands. And of course, Maine and Massachusetts were vehemently opposed to that because, again, the possibility was there. They might lose the northern half of the disputed territory. And if the decision went the other way, they might lose all of the disputed territory. The other thing is the financial woes in Maine. There also had been a collapse in the land speculation bubble in 1836. And then there was a national financial crisis the next year. Both Maine and Massachusetts urgently needed new sources of revenue, and they looked to the timber in the disputed territory to provide it. Maine was actually facing bankruptcy. And this little bar chart shows you just how rapidly the Maine debt was increasing. And the government of Maine, no matter which party was in power, was in trouble. However, there was a solution. Buckmore was a Maine land agent, and he made a report early in January of 1839. He reported that there was going to be large-scale timber cutting planned along the Upper St. John River and the Aroostook River, much more so than in previous years. And this was all going to be trespass timber cut illegally unless Maine did something about it. And the value of this timber, you know, the revenue from, I'm going to call it stumpage, but that wasn't the term at the time, was estimated to be close to $100,000. And if you look at the graph, you can see what the amount of cutting was up until 1838. And then all of a sudden, it just shoots off the map for 1839. And you can see why Buckmore's report had such an impact on the new government in Maine. Not only were they deeply in debt, but they're going to lose a lot of potential revenue by this illegal timber that was going to be cut in the disputed territory. So this must have distressed them. So their solution was to drive out the trespassers, to drive out the lumbermen who were cutting the timber illegally, or if they were going to cut the timber, to license them so Maine and Massachusetts got the revenue. So by a secret resolve in Maine, they decided to send the new Maine land agent, Rufus McIntyre, with a posse of 200 men under Sheriff Hastings Strickland to drive the lumbermen out. So they left, they came up through Masardis and moved down the Aroostook River. They had a couple of encounters with the lumbermen, nothing serious. Few shots were fired. Strickland's horse was wounded as he charged the lumbermen, but things were going well from their point of view. And the lumbermen were fleeing across the border. Meanwhile, another group did a short jog up towards Fish River and came back. But things kind of came to a head when Rufus McIntyre and some colleagues decided to spend the night in a house in the area where Fort Fairfield is. Because at that point in time, a group of New Brunswick lumbermen came across the line, kidnapped them, and sent them off to Fredericton in jail to be jailed. And one of the persons participating in this was a chap by the name of Beveridge. Anyhow, that's another story. Now, because this was done in secret, the news was slow in getting to New Brunswick. But as soon as he heard about this, Sir John Harvey, the Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick, warned Maine that if the posse did not leave immediately, he would expel them. And he began to warn his British regulars and the New Brunswick militia for duty. Maine saw this as a challenge and began calling out the state militia to support the posse. And things started to spread because neighboring states pledged support for Maine. Neighboring provinces pledged support for New Brunswick. And the United States government passed an act that authorized the president to raise a force of 50,000 militiamen and authorized the expenditure of $10 million should a war occur. So you can see this border incident had the potential to flare into a full-size conflict. Now, one of the things when you read about, yes, okay, and what happened then? So Maine mobilized the militia and they moved into the area. At the same time, the British troops were moving in the area. You know, so things were becoming, had the potential to become quite heated. Now, the interesting thing is that the American Army garrison in Holton did not become involved in this at all. This was strictly a Maine initiative. It didn't have official American support at all. So at the height of the crisis, you read stories about this, and they say 10,000 militiamen from Maine were called up. Well, that's not the case. 10,000 might have been warned, but at the most, about 3,800 were warned for duty, less than that, about 3,700, 3,600. And the total number of British involved was about 2,400, of which you only had about 1,400 British and 1,800 Americans on the frontier. So it was a much smaller force than some books will have you believe. So what to do? Neither the British nor the American governments wanted to see this evolve into a war. So the British ambassador in Washington, H.S. Fox, and the John Forsyth, the American Secretary of State, signed an agreement whereby they would defuse the situation. And basically what would happen is it would be status quo after the Maine invasion of the Aroostook River. Now, there's no problem in getting New Brunswick to agree to this because the governor, Sir John Harvey, reported directly to the Colonial Office in London. The real problem was going to be Maine and Massachusetts agreeing to this. So the American government chose General Winfield Scot to convince Maine to agree to the arrangement. So he went to Maine and he did some wheeling and dealing and dining and arm twisting, and Maine agreed to this. So what you had was a new division of jurisdiction in the area. And basically you had the British maintaining jurisdiction in the top of the disputed territory, with Maine being now in control of the Aroostook River. But that didn't last for long, because what happened is soon after the agreement was signed, the Maine posse advanced up the Fish River, and they established themselves at Soldiers Pond and waited for a British response. There wasn't one. So they moved up to what is now Fort Kent, established their presence there, waited for a response, and there wasn't one. And in retrospect, this is rather surprising because with regular forces, regular British troops in Grand Falls, Harvey could have pushed them back with no problem at all. But the problem was Harvey had fallen afoul of his political masters in London because of his interference in some of the negotiations that ended the Aroostock War border incident. So he was rather hesitant, I believe, to take firm action. And by the time anybody decided to do something, it was too late, because you had now a different change of power. You had Maine still on the Aroostook, you had Maine on the fish, and the British in the northern part of the disputed territory. So essentially, you had the disputed territory partitioned between the upper half and the lower half. And wouldn't you know it, things were not going well up there, because the members of the posse, especially in this area, were quite active in convincing the inhabitants that, yes, you're in Maine now. Yes, you're part of us. And they were also encouraging soldiers to desert from the British posts in the area. And things were getting a bit expensive for Maine to maintain the posse here. So in 1841, they reached an agreement with the American government to have the posse replaced by regular United States Army troops. And the British didn't mind this too much because, first of all, as I mentioned, the posse was making a nuisance of themselves. And the second thing is that if the border resolution resulted in it being farther south in the St. John River, it would be easier for the American regulars to leave the area than to get the posse out, because they weren't moving anywhere. So basically we have in what I call the garrison period. You had the frontier garrison with British posts here and American posts here. But things couldn't stay like this. You know, it's been several decades, and they still hadn't resolved where the border was. So in the early 1840s, both the British and the American government were prepared to bring this to an end. And it wasn't only the border controversy that was a problem. There were other issues in British-American relations at the time, and they wanted to smooth these out and resolve any issues. So what happened then is, in the summer of 1842, Lord Ashburton, the British envoy, and Daniel Webster, the American Secretary of State, met in Washington, D.C. to hammer out a treaty. And not to anybody's surprise, it was a compromise treaty. Great Britain retained control of the Grand Communications route, and the United States received 893 square miles less than the 1831 arbitration. But for our purposes, the boundary still went up the center of the St. John River. So the next thing to do was to ratify the treaty, and the United States ratified it in 1842. Now, there was some wheeling and dealing done to convince Maine and Massachusetts that this was the best solution. A little bit of skullduggery, maybe a bit of bribery, an effective PR campaign. But to sweeten the pie, each state received $150,000 in compensation for any lost claims. And in addition, Washington reimbursed Maine for the costs that it incurred during the Aroostock War. And the following year, the treaty was ratified in Great Britain. And it was done reluctantly because there was a lot of opposition in the House of Commons that the treaty gave away too much to the Americans. And it took quite a bit of effort to overcome this resistance. However, the important thing is that the British maintained the key ground, the Grand Communications. So just to conclude, you know, the Ashburton-Webster Treaty was a good compromise agreement. As I said, the British retained control of the Grand Communications route. Maine received the valuable timberlands that it wanted in the southern part of the disputed territory. But the sad part is that the Madawaska settlement was sacrificed. This was the Acadian settlement that was along both sides of the St. John River in the area of present-day Edmundston. And various options were talked about, such as maybe running the border from Fort Kent along the line going to Grand Falls. So that bank of the St. John River, the southern bank of the St. John River, could remain in British hands, and the Madawaska settlement would not be split up, but that was not to be. And in all of this, the Aroostook War was a turning point. For years and years, the boundary commissions had met. There'd been various little flare-ups along the border, but nothing substantial had happened towards establishing the border. So Maine's actions led to the partitioning of disputed territory, which in turn led to the Ashburton-Webster Treaty. Now, looking at what happened during this whole time, from 1820 onward, it was clear to me what Maine's strategy was, but I never found anything that looked like a policy document that said that until I found this letter. So, Assistant Maine Land Agent Colonel Charles Jarvis wrote to Governor John Fairfield in January of 1840. And this pretty much summarizes it. Our true policy is to proceed silently and quietly, strengthening ourselves on the territory. And while the two countries were negotiating, we should decide the question, which is exactly as they did. Which only goes to prove that possession is 9/10 of the law. And I'm going to wrap it up there and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Wow, Gary, that was great. We do have a couple questions and comments in the chat function. Can you see those questions, or would you like me to read those out?
Why don't you read them, because I really can't see them.
Okay. First question is that actually from me, and it is, have you encountered the term string beaner as a reference to Maine's ununiformed militia?
That I have not.
Okay, it's sort of a local term for the very humble militia without any uniforms, and it's sort of a lovely term, I think. But okay, so Kim Granholm makes a comment that her fifth great grandfather James Fitzhubert was involved in this incident. Kim, if you could unmute, which side was your ancestor on?
I think it depended on his mood, to be honest. He owned the Fitzherberts owned property on both sides of the border in Andover, Perth as well. So he had interests for both sides. He had a tavern, and there was a big kerfluffle. He warned people that the troops were coming up during this. This is the record I found in one of the main documents. He warned people, and he ended up getting into some trouble for that. I think he just liked chaos.
Yeah, right. Thank you for bringing his name up. Yeah, I believe it is his house that McIntyre was at when he was captured by the New Brunswick lumbermen.
Wow.
And yeah, he did get in some trouble because the Maine posse didn't take this very kindly. He figured that he was in cahoots with the lumbermen. I can't recall exactly the details there, but yeah, he had some difficulties. And what you say wasn't, unusual. There really wasn't a formal border like we know today. So people would have interest in the New Brunswick side, interest in the across the line in the disputed territory. A very fluid area. That's fascinating. Do you have any record from him, any diaries or anything?
I do not.
Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah, it is a shame, but I love the information that I found on him thus far.
Yeah.
Maybe someday I'll run across something.
Oh,
Lots
that'd
of
be
things
wonderful.
hidden up in the Fort Fairfield area. So
Yes. Yeah, trying to find personal diaries and things of the period was virtually impossible. I just had no success doing that.
no, his home isn't there anymore. There's a marker that says this is where it stood, right on the Fitzherbert Brook,
Mhm.
which looks to be right at the St. John River.
Yes.
But there's no, you can't see where anything may have been.
Yeah.
That's good stuff, though. That's a great comment.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
So the Gleasons in Bangor comment that they learned it as the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. Never heard it the other way. It's akin to Maine suddenly being dropped from what I learned was the Maine-Missouri Compromise. So what gives? What British imperial skullduggery are you up to here, Gary?
I'm just telling it the way it is. It was the Ashburton-Webster Treaty.
Alphabetical it may be, but the way it is was not.
You
write it your way, I'll write it my way.
I think we'll have to agree to disagree. So here's another great comment from the Ingalls. We understand that Fort Ingle was built to protect the portage between the St. Lawrence and the St. John. Did it play any role in the border crisis?
Okay, Fort Ingle, that's the one up in Cabano, isn't it?
Yes, on the southern shore of Lac Temiscouata. And
Yes.
it was on your map, but you never mentioned it.
Well, as I said, I was skippy hopping through this, so if we'd had more time, I could have shown you a whole bunch of pictures of the various fortifications. It was built, I'm trying to think, after the Aroostook War, but prior to the Ashburton-Webster Treaty. And it was there, again, it was at the foot of the portage route between Fort Temiscouata and the St. Lawrence River. So a rather strategic location. And it was also,
So it
a
never
supply
saw any
depot.
hostility like Fort Knox in Maine.
No, it didn't. There's no fighting.
Okay, thank you.
By the way, you should go up there because they've rebuilt the fort, or the post, I should say. And they have a very good set of reenactors there during the summertime. They do a very good job.
It was one of the greatest oxymorons that we've ever visited because it was flying the Union Jack. It was a British fort. All of the interpretive signs were bilingual, but no one, not one person of the staff there, volunteer or paid, spoke a word of English. And representing the redcoats that were posted there were a bunch of very attractive young college girls who didn't speak a word of English, and portraying the soldiers who, the ones who were from the country loved being there because they hunted and fished, but most of them were from the London area and thought they'd been sent to purgatory because there they were out in the middle of nowhere. And there was a video showing the soldiers sitting around on a modern picnic table, the young female comely British soldiers, talking about how bored they were, but in French. And I said to the Franco-American who accompanied us, John, I would think that at least for this portion of the presentation, they'd be speaking English. And he looked at me with a totally astonished look and said, oh, but they are speaking French with an English accent.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, another interesting comment from Gary and Jean Edwards says the town of Holton owns a portion of the Hancock Barracks. It came to the town because the state or county did not want it. It has remained public because it is home to meridian markers.
I was superintendent of Parks and Rec there for 20 some odd years. So it was part of my responsibility. The story of how that all happened is very interesting. And when I left, the remainder, I mean, they just pulled this little piece right out of the middle of it. And it ended up going to the county and then the town because USGS had put meridian markers there. So on your maps, the meridian should go right through where the fort is. And then the rest of it was sold as one piece to somebody living in Holton. And when I left there 20 years ago, it was still owned by that one person. So I kept trying to get people to buy it and get it fired up and let's put the fort back. But there wasn't a lot of interest.
Yeah, and that's a shame. That'd be a great historical attraction for the area. But the same thing, Fort Carlton and Grand Falls, all built over now, pretty much lost. So
Was that area of Holton the same area in which the German POW camp existed in World War II?
That was down on the backside of the hill where the airport is. And actually the border cot runs right. The town property that's the airport that was the POW camp butts up against the border.
Huh.
And, but, you know, it's just, at one time, back in the 60s, some folks kind of built a little stockade and they built a couple of little picnic shelters and a couple of little lean-tos like some of the soldiers might be living in. And then they put up a little small log home that was manufactured by a local log home manufacturer. And that eventually got moved down to the town park. But I always thought it would make a neat thing if we could just generate the interest.
Yeah, and it could, and your mention of the airport brought to mind a story from the Second World War. Lend-Lease, and the American government was lending airplanes to the British, but rather undercover, as it were. So the planes would fly into Holton and then get pushed across the border to New Brunswick.
And they'd take off on the road.
Yeah, that is a great story.
Yeah, good one. Hey, Gary, I've got another question. So you haven't really touched on the Francophone population up there and how they responded to all these soldiers marching around and whatnot. What were they making of all this?
Well, that's a good question. They were certainly, I think, a little bit puzzled by what was going on the one side. The English were saying, you know, you're part of New Brunswick, and the American settlers were saying, oh no, you're part of the United States, part of Maine. But you know, certainly they participated in the area. They were members of the New Brunswick militia, and I think they just kind of took it all in stride.
That makes sense to me. I think it's funny that in the War of 1812, you know, the French-speaking population didn't really care about the war. Their big excitement was that the Bishop of Quebec came and visited them. You know, never mind the war, the bishop is coming.
Yeah.
But were they given to understand the ramifications of splitting their community? Did they have any input in that, or was that a
No,
surprise?
they didn't have any input. That was all negotiated in Washington. You know, and as I say, the British tried to come up with a compromise border that would keep the community together, and that was rejected. And then Maine came up with another proposal whereby the border would do a little bit of a deke up, encompass John Baker's farm on the north side of the river, then come back down again. That was rejected too. But you know, no, the border being the course of the river came out pretty hard and firm.
What another element that interests me is John Quincy Adams, who, this is before he's president, he's Secretary of State. He recognized the British need for the Grand Communications route.
Mhm.
And he basically made a proposal that looked an awful lot like what actually played out. And that was in 1822, 23 or something, I think.
Okay.
And they went through all this kerfluffle, and they sort of ended up kind of following his idea anyways. It just seems like an awful lot of wasted effort, you know.
Oh, it was, but you know, people were fairly firm in their opinions, and you certainly had Maine and Massachusetts there pressing for the whole ball of wax, and the American government had to support them when it wasn't being indifferent. But yeah, no, you're right. It could have been resolved a lot sooner, but it took the Aroostock War to sort of force them to understand that, yeah, let's get this done before something happens we don't want to have happen.
So how is this related to the railroad route that eventually goes through northern Maine? Is there a relationship there?
I'm not familiar with that at all. I know at one point in time in 1830s, there was a proposal to run a line through Maine to Quebec, and Maine promptly put the kibosh to that. But, obviously, once the border is resolved, then, the railways went in, but I really don't know.
I guess that's later. Maybe that was even after the Civil War. But for a long time when I was growing up, there was only one passenger rail station in Maine, and it was way up there, and it was a Via Rail stop.
Yeah.
So that I don't know the history of Canadian railways. I should, because they're such a big part of the Confederate.
Yeah, well, there's still the railway today that goes through Macadam and Vanceboro, Maine, I think it is, and then up
Yeah.
to the eastern townships.
Yeah, and crosses the middle of the state.
Yeah.
In the 1990s, we took the train from Brownville Junction to Toronto and back. And our daughter went up to King's Landing by boarding in Mattawamkeag and getting off in Fredericton Junction. And when Via Rail petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission to abandon passenger rail service, I protested to the ICC and became an intervener. So anytime anything happened, I would get a packet in the mail about 1.5 inches thick that cost them $15 just to mail it to me from Washington. And the only joy I got out of it was knowing that I was costing the bastards money.
Josh, this Gary, I lived in Madawaska for a while too, in Presque Isle. The only railroad that I could think of that actually crossed the border, there might have been one in Fort Fairfield, but in Holton, there was one that came in just south of Holton, came in about a mile into town and stopped, had a nice yard there, but they had to lug everything another mile down through the middle of town to hook up with the B&A. So, and it didn't last. It's now a snowmobile trail.
Yeah.
But I think the ownership was part of the problem with some of that stuff. That little piece of rail from the border to the town, the middle of town, at one point each piece was developed by a different person. So there were about 3 different owners of 3 miles of track. We tried to get it abandoned, and the government didn't even want to talk about it. The Canadian government didn't even want to talk about abandoning it. So we gave up and just used it.
Gotcha. I think I was thinking about the one that was used during the American Civil War to transport troops through to Quebec, I think. That ring any bells?
To where?
Well, I think this is part of the Trent affair, where the U.S. Navy had captured a British ship and some diplomats. We almost went to war with Britain during the Civil War, and they end up transporting a bunch of troops to, the heart of Canada, Ontario, and they had to get. And I think they went through Maine territory actually to do that. Am I making that up? Does this ring a bell?
Well, yeah. What happened is the rail line you're thinking about. They were trying to be very modern at the time. So there was a chunk of rail line that went from St. Andrews, New Brunswick, up towards Woodstock. And they put the first troops up that, but it wasn't up to the job, snowstorms.
Okay.
So they eventually sent everybody by sleigh up the Grand Communications route along the St. John River.
Oh, okay.
And there was almost 11,000 troops went over that route in December, January, February, 1861, 1862.
Gee.
Wow.
Yep.
All right. Does anybody else have any comments or questions? Well, this has been a great discussion.
I think having something on the railroad development in Maine would be interesting. Mike, maybe you could do something about that.
Maybe I could, but I have a friend who's the recently retired president of the New England Steam Company, a nonprofit that's restoring Maine's last steam
Take him to lunch.
And yeah, and maybe we could interest him in a presentation, because he was whacked right out on space when I met him in the 1980s, but he's since transferred to rail. So maybe I could interest him in that, and I'll be in touch with you.
That would be great.
Thank you.
But as I said at the opening, I just sort of talked about the peaks, didn't get into the valleys of the whole story. So if you really want to know more about it, do read the book, The Aroostook War of 1839. As being pointed out, I'm telling it from the British perspective, hence the Ashburton-Webster Treaty. I also worked to dispel some of the misinformation that's floating around. And there's a lot of it out there because people pick up a half-baked story and they keep repeating it, and eventually it becomes the truth. But, I think if you read the book, you'll probably get a fairly honest perspective of what happened. I try to be a little bit ecumenical, give each side their due.
What was the story about? I had a friend whose wife's ancestor was in the canoe with the flag, and they reenact that. Something, I don't know, up in the Presque Isle, Fort Fairfield area during the Aroostook War. She did something with an American flag.
Not familiar with that one.
They had a reenactment for. Maybe Gary, do you know?
Dan's arriving.
No, that's nothing I've ever heard of. I mean, in Madawaska, in the early 70s, 76, the Acadian Festival began, and they every year have a reenactment of the 3-4 families that first settled in that region coming down the river and stopping.
She was an Acadian, this lady. That's
No.
all I know, but I'll try to find out more.
And
Yeah, that'd be,
Les Acadiens Van Buren, they reenact the landing of the 12 original
Yep.
Acadian families coming to Van Buren, just about every year. And they've this huge park with a monument to each of the 12 families and a 30-foot cross and a fieldstone.
Oh, yeah.
And a
That's it.
life-size sculpture of the trapper in his dugout canoe. And I said to this same friend that I was at Fort Ingle with, I said, John, there's one thing wrong with this park. And he said, what's that? I said, there's nothing here that says why this park is here, right on US 1 in Van Buren. And he looks at me and says, well, everybody knows.
It's in Madawaska, St. David. It's right down behind the St. David Church
Right, exactly. Yeah.
on
Read.
Ernie Chassie's land.
I'd like to mention that I'm surprised that Bob Dallison has been reticent about the reenactment of the Aroostook Border War that never happened during his tenure as director of King's Landing. And once a year we would commemorate that. And I always got stuck playing the American, but Bob.
Defend yourself.
Megan, the librarian at Fort Fairfield is fantastic. I don't know if you know her or if you've ever dealt with them at Fort Fairfield Library, but I have found that they have a wealth of information. She's really done a great job learning the history of that particular community.
Interesting.
yeah, I've been up there a few times. I think I saw a job notice here a while ago. I think they're hiring a new librarian.
She didn't tell me that.
Yeah, I
She
saw
drove me
it.
around. I drove 6 hours. I'm from Southern Maine, and I drove nearly 6 hours to go up there and do some research on my families. And she drove me around town and showed me all the different
Wow.
locations. I mean, it was just amazing. Yeah, great lady.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure there was a job notice here 3-4 months ago, looking for a librarian for I think they call it the Acadian Center. The library at University of Maine, Fort Pitt.
Oh, okay.
You mean Lise Pelletier's job?
Yes. I thought so. I could be wrong. Could be another job.
I was talking about the Fort Fairfield Public Library.
Oh, Fort Fairfield. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been in there several times. Yeah, they've got a.
My third great grandfather built it.
Oh, good.
Okay, folks, well, it's past 7. I want to thank Gary again. Great job, Gary.
Oh, thank
That
you.
was wonderful.
Well done. I am so disappointed that Bob Dallison would not take the bait, though.
Well, it's out of character, isn't it?
He's a great guy. Hey, I want to wrap up by saying that this is one of a whole series of just great presentations And the next one is being done by a very special historian, a guy named Alan Taylor, who's now at the University of Virginia, of all places. But he wrote a very famous book called Liberty Men and Great Proprietors. And it really sort of transformed the historical profession. It's a book that I've just about worn out going back and forth. Really just an amazing book. And he's a very nice guy, as it turns out, too. And he does lots of presentations because his heart is still in Maine. His paycheck may be in Virginia, but I think his heart is up here. Pam, can you tell us what topic Alan's going to be talking about next month?
Well, he's going to talk about the great proprietors and the land and how it evolved, but more up in the north and east of the state.
Oh, terrific.
So, and it, you know, I mean, I was just thrilled that he's doing this for us. And then in January, you know, we have to go back and forth. So we'll have a Canadian in January, and that's Jacques Poitras talking about he wrote the book on the imaginary line about the border and how blurry it was for the longest of time. So we have some good stuff coming up.
Yeah. Good stuff. All righty, folks. I think on that note, I'm going to say good evening to everybody. Thanks again to Gary. I look forward to hopefully seeing all of you next month when we do Alan Taylor. And what is the date of that, Pam?
Oh, you had to ask. The third Thursday.
Okay, the third Thursday of December.
It's always the third. We try to always have it the third Thursday of the month. I think it's the 16th or 17th. I can find out for sure if you want.
No.
16th.
Okay, and then January is around that same time frame. So yes, if you folks are here for the first time, I hope that you'll come to that. And to our long time people, we're so happy that you stayed with us.
And could I wish everyone a happy American Thanksgiving?
Back at you.
Yes, but we missed Canadian Thanksgiving.
But if it happens to be a blizzard that day, we're gonna vote for Canada next time.
Yeah.
It's at the end of the harvest season. Can you imagine the